homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. If you are new here, thanks for joining me in my kitchen. If you are returning, welcome back. This is a continuation of a 3-part video series on what to do with potatoes. Potatoes are pretty shelf stable. They will sit, in a cool, dark place for a good long time after you harvest them. But come, December, January, they start to sprout, especially if you don't have them in a refrigerator. And by February or so, they're starting to look like spaghetti. And if you want to save the rest of that harvest for the rest of the year, you need to do something with them because they won't hold any longer than that. And so your options are you can freeze them or you can can them. This video is about how to can potatoes. And so I have an example here of some potatoes that I canned. And you do need a pressure canner in order to can potatoes. And there is no other option. So please don't water bath can potatoes. It's just not safe. And if you're going to pressure can potatoes, you peel them first. Peeling them is important. It's part of removing a lot of that bacterial load that might be on the outside of potatoes. And so you do need to peel them. Ideally, if you're going to can potatoes, you want to use a waxy style potato, so a red potato or maybe a Yukon Gold. You do not want to try to can russets. They tend to be very floury. They have a different type of starch, and they are more likely to just kind of fall apart in the canning process. And so you want something that's going to hold its shape. And they get peeled, they get chopped. You want them to be in 2-inch pieces or smaller. And then you're going to par cook them for about 15 minutes in boiling water. And then you put them in the jars and you pressure can them for, I think pints are 35 minutes and quarts are 40 minutes. You can add a little bit of salt to your can before you put everything in there. And that's going to help flavor the potatoes. There are some people out there who comment that canned potatoes aren't fully cooked. That is incorrect. I'm not quite sure where that perception is coming from. A pressure canner, when it's up to 10 pounds of pressure, is going to be about 240 degrees, so considerably above the boiling point. And you're going to hold those at pressure for 35 to 40 minutes. And that's not including the time that they're cooking while things are heating up and while things are cooling down. These are very well cooked. However, I think the process of pressure canning them does change the texture a little bit. And that's what people are commenting on. They're expecting them to be cooked like a mashed potato would be cooked, and they're not. They actually surprisingly will hold their shape fairly well. And so these are not great as a mashed potato when you take them out of the jar. You could mash them and probably do that with them. But what I like to do with them is pan fry them. And I actually learned this when I was 12 or 13 years old. I had a stepfather who really loved to camp and fish. And one of his staples that he just always kept in his ready-to-go box was canned potatoes. I had never even realized there was such a thing as canned potatoes. You can find them in the grocery aisle in the canned food section. And he would buy canned sliced potatoes, and then he would just cook up some bacon, throw those sliced potatoes in there with a little bit of onion, and we would have, a fried egg and bacon and canned sliced potatoes crisped up in that bacon fat for breakfast. And it was fantastic. And so I have literally been keeping canned potatoes on my shelf and in my camping box for going on 40 years. And that is what we use them for. So we don't can a ton of these because they're not something we use a lot. We tend to use frozen ones more commonly in day-to-day cooking. But for camping, these are fantastic, or for just a quick morning meal when you don't want to have to hassle with slicing everything, and frying up potatoes can take quite a while for them to cook all the way through and get soft, and these are already cooked all the way through. And so really all you need to do is get a good crisp on them, which takes like 5 to 10 minutes. So really great breakfast staple, canned potatoes. The other thing I wanted to address before we get into the actual video here is there are people on YouTube that are canning potatoes without any liquid in the jar. And that is a recipe for botulism. It's just not safe. It is not recommended by any testing authority. And I don't know where this idea has come from that somehow that is safe. The thing about botulism is it doesn't have any odor and it doesn't have any flavor. And so you can have botulism spores in a canned food product and have absolutely no idea that they're in there, and you can make someone seriously ill. It's particularly unsafe if you are young or old or immunocompromised, and it is not worth taking that risk. Rose Red Homestead did a great video on canning potatoes where she talked about this, and her example was such a good thing to be able to get your head around, which is if you were to put your hand in an oven that was 240 degrees, you could hold your hand in that oven for a pretty good amount of time before it got too warm and you needed to remove it. But if you put your hand in water or oil, you couldn't really get water up to 240 degrees, but you could get oil up to 240 degrees. If you were to put your hand in oil at 240 degrees, it would immediately burn you and blister your skin, and you would have to pull back. That's because liquids are a much better conductor of heat than air. And if you're putting potatoes in a jar with no liquid and then canning them for the amount of time that's called for in a typical canning book or the National Home Food Preservation Center, you are not conducting the heat into those potatoes in a way that was what was tested. And you have no idea whether that heat has actually penetrated to the middle of that potato for the length of time that it needs to penetrate in order to kill any botulism spores that are in that jar. So please, please, I beg you, do not dry can potatoes. I don't care how many people you've seen on YouTube that have done it who have said, hey, nothing happens. Basically, your anecdotal evidence that something is safe does not trump actual science. So please use liquid when you're canning your potatoes. That will make them safe and that will make them shelf stable. And they really are a delicious staple to have on your shelf when you want to put together a quick dinner or a quick breakfast using fried up potatoes. So, canned potatoes, let's get started.
So the variety of potato that I'm using in this recipe, these are called pinto, and they come in kind of a mottled red and yellow, which I find very attractive. They are a waxy, somewhat similar to a Yukon Gold style potato, and these have been in storage since we picked them in the garden, probably late September, early October. I do have a video on that harvest. And this one had a little bit of discoloration. I'm not sure if there was a little bit of freezing damage that happened, and I wasn't sure how deep it went, and so I cut the potato in half just to check, and it was just on the surface, and so I just scraped off any extra darkening and color that I had there. And then I am chopping these up into about 1-inch pieces, give or take. You can do as large as 2-inch, but I find that if they're really chunky, they don't fit in the jar all that well, and so a little bit smaller is probably easier. And what I'm doing here is I'm putting everything in the jars initially, and then I'll dump those jars out and par cook them. And this way I know exactly how many jars I need. And you can see here I'm under 2 inches, which is what's important. So I've got my water boiling. I'm going to par cook these. I ended up with 6 jars. I wasn't sure how many jars I was going to need for the amount of potatoes that I had. Thankfully, my pressure canner holds more than this, so it's 1 load. And I'm just going to dump those into this water, bring it back to a boil. A little overfill on the pot there. And for potatoes that are close to 2 inches, you want to boil these for about 10 minutes. If they're smaller than that, the National Center for Home Food Preservation indicates that you can just boil them for about 2 minutes if they're 1/2 inch. So I probably overcooked these just slightly, but it wasn't a huge deal. And then rather than draining everything, because I was thinking I wanted to save that liquid, I just scooped everything out with a spider here. And then I ended up not using the liquid. I could have just thrown these in a colander. And you can see they're a little overcooked. And then I'm adding a 1/2 teaspoon of canning and pickling salt per pint here. And potatoes just need a little bit of salt. And then I ended up running a little bit of water on these just to cool them down enough that I could handle them because they were way too hot. And then back into the jars they go. And I know they're all going to fit because they all fit before. And so it's a little bit tricky to figure out how to get them all in there and get them below the surface of the liquid. But they do all go back in. And this was so much easier once I cooled these off just slightly. And as long as everything is about the same temperature when you put it into the canner, things can be a little bit cooler. Everything doesn't have to be perfectly boiling. You can cool things off and then have your water be a little bit cooler. And as that water comes back to a boil, everything's going to just warm back up again. So just basically match your temperatures and you're going to be just fine. We're not going to actually start our timer for our canner until everything's been boiling and steam has been releasing from the pressure canner for 10 minutes, and that's going to give this plenty of time to go back to the full boiling temperature that it was at before. I'm just shaking these and giving them a bit of a twist to pack things down without using my fingers to squish those potatoes because I didn't want to squish them down. And that worked pretty well. Some of these are a little bigger than others, and so it was a bit of a challenge to get them in there. But you get the idea. And I had one white potato, and then most of these were the pinto. You can see the white one there on the corner. All right, everything back in. And then rather than reuse the water that these potatoes were boiled in, I just had some fresh boiling water here to top these off. I didn't have a lot of liquid left in that pot, and so I just decided to start over. So this is boiling water from my kettle. You want 1-inch headspace, and you want all of your potatoes should be under that liquid, again, so that that heat can transfer into those potatoes. This is a handy little gadget to measure 1-inch headspace. Most of these were pretty good. And then in order to debubble without actually sticking something in there and again breaking up those potatoes, which I didn't want to do, I'm just giving everything a good twist to release any air bubbles that might be in there. And they're pretty chunky, and so there wasn't a lot of trapped air anyway. You want to wipe your rims well. Any starch that's on those rims is going to help keep things from sealing, and so you want to make sure everything's well cleaned. And wide mouth jars are much easier to use in this situation than the regular mouth jars. I didn't have enough wide mouth jars, so I've got a couple regular mouth jars here too. But that wide opening is much easier when you've got something chunky like a potato. And then lid, new lids, don't reuse your lids, especially when you're pressure canning. There's a good chance they won't seal well if you're reusing them. You shouldn't reuse them anyway, but particularly with a pressure canner. And then the ring that goes on here, you want it to be finger tight. So just where it really starts to get a good grip. You don't want it so tight that the pressure that's inside that jar can't release around that edge of that jar lid. You want that air to be able to release. And so super tight, and you're going to end up with buckled lids. Those fit very nicely into my pressure canner. And then I like to readjust everything, make sure everything's got plenty of room. And then the way every pressure canner is slightly different, so follow the directions for yours. But I vented this for 10 minutes without the weight on it, and then put the weight on, and then let the weight come back up to 10 pounds of pressure. And when that starts rocking, then I start my timer. And so I'm timing these for 35 minutes. And then letting everything cool down naturally. Now everything is no longer under pressure. Usually I leave the lid off for about 5 minutes, but we actually had to run some errands. And so these sat in the canner for probably a half an hour. And so they were cool enough that I could just remove them immediately. And then if you notice, even though those jars have been cooled and they were not under pressure, they are still bubbling. And that is an indication that the pressure got really high inside the jar, which is what you want. And it's also an indication that those seals are good, and all 6 of these jars sealed. So we were successful. So there you go, canned potatoes. Please do it safely, but it is well worth having on your shelf. Give this recipe a try, tribe. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.